Well, he was originally Gunnar, Gunnar, because he's half Swedish, but then everyone wanted it to be Gunnar as in gun. I just wanted to look at someone. I mean, you think, this idea of people going to the war and coming back with opiate problems, people seem to think only happened in Vietnam, happened in Afghanistan with Russians, happened in World War II, because the field hospital basically just injected you with morphine because they didn't really have time or the ability to do anything else. So a lot of people who came back after World War II had opiate problems, and it's not very well known. And I thought it'd be quite interesting to have a look at that because it's not the context most people think. If you'd write a book about Vietnam, you would kind of almost expect that. But, in World War II, it's not so obvious. And also, Glasgow during World War II was a kind of weird place. It was known as a place you could disappear. A lot of people, more than people think, went and did basic training, came back and never went back to the army. They just went underground. So that was quite interesting. And it was an enormous amount of crime, partly because there weren't any police, really. So a bit like the 70s, it was a time when Glasgow was kind of in turmoil. And it was quite interesting to have a little look at that, I thought. It's the one thing that drives me insane if I read a book where it's got written dialogue that looks at written, as written speech. It's not, people don't talk in sentences. They don't, hello, I'm just about to go to the shops, and I hate when you read people talking and it's written speech. And it's the bit I probably spend most time on is the actual dialogue, because I think if you can get that right, you tend to believe the person exists, that they talk in a certain way and each person talks a different way. And you have to stick to that, or else it's a bit difficult. But, some people are, Giles Nickerson's pretty easy to do because, we all know that. And, Gunners, because most working class Scottish men, particularly in the 40s, they were pretty non-vocal. They weren't very, chatty or sharing their emotions and stuff. So you kind of have to get some of that in there. So it's interesting to write how people speak. He gets a little bit of flashbacks. And he's physically been affected by it, but he gets a bit of flashbacks every so often of his loud noises and stuff like that. But, in most cases, these guys came back from the war and went back to their work on the Monday morning. There was no buffer or, idea that people should have some sort of talk to someone or something. They basically arrived back on Saturday from Germany and started working Monday, so it was very much submerged into, and some people dealt with it in better ways than others. So there was a little bit of that in it there. Yeah, definitely. Some of that is still, and that's partly why his opiate problem is not going away. Self-medication. Well, he was a detective, or just about to become a detective in, I think, 39, and joined up. And he gets caught in quite a bad bombing in France and is left with some bad injuries and, some problems. And he comes back to Glasgow, ostensibly to find out, on leave, to find out whether he's ever going to go back to the army or not. But when he gets there, his old boss appears and asks him to help solve a case, because what happened in Glasgow during the war was the kind of middle bit of the police force all went to the war. So they had to call back retired people to come and do things. And then they had a thing called the police auxiliary, which was like 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds who did traffic, that sort of stuff. But that main bit in the middle that would investigate cases wasn't there. So his old boss tries to persuade him to help him investigate a case where they found a dead body in a bombed out building. Glasgow was hit by bombs, at that point. But the body seems to have been mutilated to make him unidentifiable. So Gunnar sort of reluctantly says, okay, I'll help you out, And that's how it starts, really. He meets up with a guy called Giles Nickerson, who is a sort of posh, from the very beginning of the English Secret Service, who's in Glasgow for a slightly bizarre, reason that doesn't tell him. And, the beginning of the English Secret Service was full of nutters, it was full of mad people. And it's, in the next book, which takes place in New York just before Pearl Harbor, in this, Ian Fleming was there. God, it was Hardy Amos, who was the Queen's dressmaker, was there. It was full. The Secret Service was full of incredibly strange people. So, in a contrast to Gunnar's kind of Glasgow thing, I thought it'd be quite nice to have some posh bloke wandering about going, in Glasgow, to everyone's abject horror. So, he's good fun to write. Again, so that's quite good. And there's a few little people in there. His brother's I can never say this word, conscientious objector, which again, people don't really think about much in the context of World War II. They do in World War I, but for some reason World War II. But they were there, and so it was, as always, I'm kind of interested in the little margins of things, not the big, and here we are invading Stalingrad, I'm more in the sort of, what happened to these people that were sort of at the periphery. So that was kind of what was interesting, I think. There's a character in it who's a dancer, who's, I'll be perfectly honest, name escapes me at the moment. Um, and she's sort of the main female character in there. And I know women that talk like her in Glasgow, I know what they say. And also there's the what you would call the coroner in the McCoy books is a woman, and again she's a sort of upper middle class Scottish woman, and they have a particular way of talking. And I think, as I said, if you can find the voice, I don't think it really matters if they're male or female, particularly unless that's hugely integral to the plot. But if you can find the voice, you can kind of find the character, I think, and that's often the way to do it, or the way I do it. The 70s I can remember because I was 10 or 11 when these books were, and that's a time when you remember a lot. It's before you become a teenager and become sort of self-obsessed. So quite a lot remember there, but obviously I don't remember the 40s at all. But I think what I always, as it said, do your research and throw 90% of it away, because there's nothing worse than reading people's research disguised as a book, and the temptation when you get something like the 40s is to list all the differences between then and now, and try and tell people how everything was completely different. And it just doesn't read very well, it just reads like research. And I think what's important is tiny little bits of research. You do it all this much and use this one bit. That's enough. You kind of keep it in the back of your head when you're writing, but don't regurgitate it. So if I was giving anyone any advice, I'd say, do your research and then try and forget most of it, because that's not what people want to read.